what is the difference between the Atlas rocket that put John Glenn in orbit and the one that's got a nuclear warhead on it and it's got, you know, Moscow's name on it? And he said, attitude. So, as Kennedy said in his speech at Rice University, technology itself is neutral, and what we choose to do with it, well, you know, that's another realm. You know, that's a realm of policy, of economics, of ethics, and of philosophy. Now, speaking for myself, and you know, Kevin, feel free to disagree with me, of course. I tend to be a little bit of an optimist. So, you know, when you say something like, you know, we think the same way as we did in the Stone Age, well, I suppose from a biochemical standpoint, yes, our brain biologically functions the same way as it did back in the day. But I do honestly think that the net benefit of science and advancement has been a positive one. And yes, you know, there are wars, there are crimes. We still, you know, visit sins upon each other. Didn't mean to use that word, but anyway. But you know, at the same time, we're living longer. We have, you know, a higher quality of life than at any other time in history, frankly. And a lot of this has to be credited to scientific advancement. Do you have anything to add to that, Kevin?
Yeah. Well, oh, you wanted to say something?
Well, I was just going to sort of, you know, yin and yang, you know, just kind of contribute a little bit to that. Okay. I guess one of the things that I always find fascinating, like I'm much like Eric in the sense that, you know, I like to try and be optimistic, but there is a realist side of me too that exists. And when I enter into conversations or listen to debates about the whole idea of weaponization of space versus militarization of space, and you know, should there be some sort of police force in space, and how do you define that police force, and all of this kind of stuff. And I think the way I look at it is that kind of sort of really picks away at sort of what we as human beings are, right? We've never been a completely peaceful species, right? I mean, I don't think there exists a living organism on Earth that doesn't have its, you know, sort of, you know, that doesn't get ticked off at something. So I think that the whole idea of being able to move forward and, as Eric says, you know, use these technologies for, you know, good rather than bad, really calls into question, you know, can the human species ever, you know, rise above or ever evolve to the point where there are no differences and there is no sense of, you know, I deserve this and you don't, and these kinds of negative things that, you know, perpetuate into space exploration.
Yeah, the question was posed initially in this discussion about the priorities. So what my thinking is that I'm just wondering whether we have a dual priority, you know, technological, but also a human investigation of how we behave and our attitudes and value systems. And I think we've fallen behind that in evolution as compared to the evolution of technology. And this is why I think we have a lot of these problems of warfare and global warming. If we used our minds and to cope with the difficulties and the problems that technology poses. It seems to me maybe we are starting, but we seem to be going gung-ho in space, which is all sexy and that, it's all interesting, fine. And it does have side benefits. But there's risk involved in the sense of not just human life, but potential disaster by ignoring these other problems on Earth. So I'm just wondering whether both should be given priority.
Well, both should absolutely be given priority. And what I think is important to realize is that they do go hand in hand. And I'm just thinking back to a very interesting statement that Spider Robinson the Canadian science fiction writer, made a number of years ago. He was interviewed by the CBC on the occasion of the Mars Pathfinder landing in 1997. And he was asked, what is the value of this space exploration stuff, when very much the question that you had posed, when we seem to be so far behind in so many other moralistic and humanistic aspects. And he had a very interesting answer. He said, the value of exploration to him is that every time the human race has opened a new frontier, we've learned to behave ourselves a little bit better. So if we look at the last frontiers on Earth, being the oceans and the Antarctica, we could have gone in there and plundered those places, as had been done for a lot of other places on the Earth in the past, but we didn't. And in fact, there are international agreements in place governing the responsible use of the seabed and of Antarctica and protecting these fragile places. So by extension, as we go out into space, these are very sophisticated technologies that we're dealing with that, yes, are very similar to the technologies that are used for warfare. But as we push there, travel is broadening, as Carl Sagan liked to say. And as we move out into space and broaden our horizons, then it is, I think, a driver for us to, again, as Spider Robinson said, behave ourselves a little bit better. And indeed, if we look at our exploration of Mars as an example, there are very strict international agreements in place for planetary protection so that we're not contaminating Mars and potentially threatening any putative life forms that might be there as well. So again, I remain an optimist, and I think that these two things go in parallel. And perhaps just to close off that point, Carl Sagan, I'll invoke Carl again, but he always, Carl, yeah. Carl Sagan always got a laugh at these sort of alien invasion type sci-fi films or books or TV shows where the aliens would come down to the Earth and plunder us. Well, this doesn't actually make sense in a lot of ways. So first of all, if a civilization were to have the resources of most of the universe at its disposal, why would they come to take our fresh water or our cerveza or something? And his second argument, which I also find compelling, is that, again, these are the same technologies of warfare. So if a civilization were to be able to employ these constructively to get across the gulf of space, then surely their morals and their ethics must also be at a very high level, because simply if they weren't, they would have used those technologies to have blown themselves up a long time ago. So a bit of a rambling thought there, but I remain an optimist, and I think that these two things, as you say, are equally important, and very fortunately they do go hand in hand.
And just to add, or something to keep in mind too, that I find interesting, if you think back to the 1960s, why did the Americans want to go to the moon? Well, they wanted to beat the Russians.
Yes,
right?
For military reasons.
Right. You look at the whole, going to the moon and Mars now, it's less about, the Americans beating anybody else. I'm not saying that those undertones don't exist in somebody's mind, but the promoted emphasis or the promoted ideal in doing that is us as a human race, and you see a greater sense of cooperation going on. So I just sort of throw that out there as something to watch in the upcoming missions.
I'm glad you're both optimistic. Just one brief comment. It seems to me that the government seems to be pulling the strings in which direction science takes. Perhaps scientists have a little more brains than some of our politicians. Perhaps we could, or scientists could pull a few strings and withhold the usage of some of this technology for military purposes.
And that's why you have organizations like the Society working in Ottawa as close as we can to develop national policies and such.
Thank you.
And I have to go to the work as a general labor. Even I was